We're glad you're back with us, and it's discussion time, and we're going back to Charles Cochran's question about the church existing without elders and deacons. And as you pointed out, that's the way the church started. It may have been under the apostles, but there would be a transitional period in which elders and deacons would be the established leadership in the church.
And I think that's one thing we need to mention, David, is that cannot be a continuation of the church. People today look at the church in terms of denominationalism. Many denominations have no elders or deacons, and they don't really go to the Bible and find the pattern of the organization of the church. And in the pattern of church organization, there are to be elders and deacons.
Plurality of men.
Right.
Leaders.
And so we're not saying that it's a continuation and it's okay to scripturally exist without them, and that whatever people do today, it really doesn't matter. It does matter. If you do have men who are qualified, then they should be put in that role. But we're just simply saying that, as you mentioned, in the transitional stage of the early church, and even congregations existing today where there are no scripturally qualified, it'd be better not to have men put in an office if they're not qualified.
Now you pointed out,
better than that. To have that.
You pointed out Titus 1:5, set in order the things that are lacking, wanting.
So a church without elders and deacons is not truly scripturally organized until those men are put into the office, if they are qualified. If they're not qualified, then certainly they should not be placed in
You'd be better off
role.
without them than to have men unqualified.
I remember when I first became a Christian making the statement that a church can't exist without having elders, and I was put in my place pretty quick. And but once I study the book of Acts, it's interesting. You see, at the beginning of the church, you had apostolic authority in Jerusalem. But as the church grew and expanded in different locations, you see a transition. I think it began around Acts chapter 6 with the servants there and their roles. And then in Acts chapter 14, as Charles mentioned earlier, and the ordaining elders in every church. And you see at that point sort of a switch from apostolic authority to independent autonomous authority within the congregation. Philippians 1:1, elders and deacons. And you got that.
Well, there were not enough apostles to go around to oversee all the churches and all the places.
Correct. And they weren't, that office wasn't, it was only a temporary office.
Temporary, that's right.
I would only add, we have to fight against what might be the common opinion of some, that you cannot exist without elders and deacons, and sometimes that forces people into a position of putting men in the office who are not qualified, as Charlie was saying. You just got to be patient. I think even 1 Timothy 3:1 describes that the appointment of those men as elders, it's a growth process, because the desire there is not something that happens overnight. It's an office that's achieved by years and years of submitting yourself to those, those qualifications that are there. So it takes time to grow into mature organization. But as I think Charlie did a great job showing, we always ought to work toward that end. Men ought to have the desire to do that.
That is correct. Okay. Let's move on about Simon's sin, and I think Shane pointed out quite clearly that Simon was a believer, a follower of Jesus Christ. He transgressed, and he needed to get that straightened out with God. But some would deny that if you sin, that you were ever saved to begin with. Once saved, always saved, the old doctrine of Calvinism. Anything else on this particular question?
I'm looking forward to David's question. And I think Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12 is a clear passage. It's my go-to passage to talk about apostasy, where the writer there says, "Beware, brethren," speaking to Christians, "lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in," it's the same word that we get in English, apostasy, apostoi, in departing from the living God. There's a warning, don't lose your faith. And don't turn your back on God.
Yeah, in Galatians 5:4.
And one thing real quick to go along with what Shane has said, that whenever a person is baptized, it doesn't remove their temptations. If they have a problem with drinking or drugs or any number of sins, Simon had the problem there with love of money and his heart wasn't right. Baptism did not miraculously remove that temptation.
Right.
And so we have to be careful that we don't go back into sin.
Right. He was asking something that only the apostles had, and that was the ability to pass on the gifts. That's what he wanted, and he didn't have part nor portion in that. He was not an apostle. And that particular work would cease with the demise of the apostles as they would died off. Well, let's move right on. I want to get to David's question about the fellow said he was confused about the interpretation of Matthew 24. And David, I think you hit the nail on the head about the proper division of the chapter. It's sad that so many theologians and folks who are studying this subject take the signs of the first part of Matthew 24 and try to apply that to end times.
Sure.
And that is a gross mistake, but you can hear it any day of the week.
Oh, yes.
It's preached long and loud.
Yes, and of course Jesus put that application to rest when he said, "This generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." So he placed a generational context, a limitation upon the fulfillment of those elements that were related to the destruction of Jerusalem. I always find it interesting, you raised that point about the application, modern day application. That application is always made after the fact. Some event transpires and they'll say, well, that must have been what he was talking about. And yet Jesus in Matthew 24 was showing them that you can know in advance that the destruction of Jerusalem is going to take place. It was a prediction of that event. But clearly, I think if people can make the division that he is addressing the specific physical destruction of Jerusalem in about the first 34, 35 verses, he makes a very clear transition in verse 36 to talk about the end of the world. There's a difference between those and the nature of those two events. And so judgment or the end of the world is something that man cannot know other than that it will happen, but we can't know the times or the seasons. No one knows when that's going to transpire. But the destruction of Jerusalem, this was clearly given to disciples to warn them to get out when they saw these things transpiring. So it was of great benefit to them. And I think, as we said, the context, the physical context, he's there, he's pointing back at Jerusalem, and they're talking about the destruction of this city. That it very well limits it to that particular application.
And going along with what David has said, these warning signs are given to the disciples. And if it were the coming of the Lord, why would you worry about your flight being in winter or on the Sabbath day? That wouldn't matter. When Jesus comes, it's sudden, it's final. But with the fall of Jerusalem,
no travel plans.
The falling of Jerusalem, there's problems that would exist in the fall of Jerusalem that these disciples would not want to be caught in those situations that would be difficult for them. But if it's the coming of the Lord, that's not going to matter.
Well, and even the abomination of desolation that Jesus speaks of, Luke explains clearly, Luke 21:20, Jerusalem is surrounded by armies.
That's right.
And that took place in 70 A.D. Yeah. You want to?
Well, it's my view as it relates to eschatological discussions or final things. It's important to keep the plain things the main things, and the main things the plain things.
That's
and
a good.
There's a lot of stuff that's in the figurative language that's difficult.
Yeah.
But Jesus says you be ready because you don't know when.
That's right.
That's the main thing we want to keep in mind.
All right, and we're down to 30 seconds, and that's the main thing we got to get signed off. I guess that's the last word on that one, though. But this may generate other questions that you have, and get them into us. We'll be waiting to hear from you. I'm your host, David Wade, in behalf of Shane Robinson and Charles Cochran and David Smith. It's been a pleasure being with you today, and we'll hope to see you next time. Watch all the good broadcasting on GBN, and until we meet again, may God bless you.
GBN Q&A is a production of the Gospel Broadcasting Network. If you have Bible questions you would like answered on the program, send them to GBN Q&A, P.O. Box 23604, Chattanooga, Tennessee 37422. Our email address is questions@gbntv.org. Join us next time for your questions and the Bible's answers on GBN Q&A.